Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge and welcome to this video, the subject of which is my grandmother. I mean, my grandmother. I've actually been thinking about making a video on the grandmother for quite a long time. Quite a few people have asked me what I think about it, and a few people have asked me to make a video on it as well. I just haven't had the time. It hasn't been one of my priorities, I have to say. I'm making the video today because very recently I decided to sell the synthesizer, and actually last night on a certain auction website I sold it. So I'm now under a little bit of pressure to put the synthesizer in its box and send it off to its new proud owner. Now, the reason why I've decided to sell the synthesizer is not because I dislike it or I've got bored with it or whatever. It's because I've got, as you might be able to see from the synth behind me here, I've got the Moog Matriarch. And the Matriarch really does replace the grandmother in absolutely every conceivable way. So this video is under a little bit of time pressure. As I said, I've got to do the video all in one day. There won't be quite as much sort of hands-on knob twiddling and sound creation that I might have otherwise wanted to do with a video like this. It's really going to be my thoughts on the grandmother, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, my thoughts on sort of an upgrade to a Matriarch and whether that makes sense. It's going to be quite a wordy video, not too much playing, so I do apologise for that, but I really do hope you enjoy it. So thank you very, very much for watching. So if I think back to when the Moog Grandmother was first announced, not yet released, I have to say, if I'm totally honest, I wasn't exactly enamoured with the idea of it. Now the first reason for that is the form factor, and it's a very, very personal thing, but I really wasn't in the market for a synthesizer of this kind of size and dimensions with a full-size keyboard on it. A lot of semi-modular gear these days is little desktop units or little units that can be put into a Eurorack case, and that's the kind of thing that I would have preferred to have seen from Moog in terms of a semi-modular synthesizer. But I know that that's a very, very personal thing, but with a synthesizer of this kind of size, this really ends up being the centerpiece in your Eurorack kind of setup, if I'm honest. But there are a couple of other reasons why I wasn't enamoured with this particular synthesizer, and these are stupid reasons, I have to admit. One was I just didn't like the name, the grandmother. It's just a daft name. I mean, to me, a synthesizer should have a cool name, like Andromeda, or Prophet, or Quantum, or Deep Mind. Even Deep Mind's a cool name for a synthesizer. Grandmother is just plain daft. And I know that's a stupid reason for not really being keen on a synthesizer, but I've got my grandmother here in my arms. The other reason I wasn't particularly enamoured by it was the colour scheme. I mean, I hadn't seen one in the flesh like this. I'd only seen photographs of one, and I just looked at the colour scheme and these sort of pastel shades of yellow and green and red and blue. It's like a baby blue here. And I thought, well, what the hell are you doing? It looks like a child's toy. I don't take it seriously. And I know those are stupid reasons for not being keen on the synthesizer, but they did kind of have an effect on me right at the very, very beginning. The other thing I wasn't particularly keen on was what I thought by Moog was a little bit of a marketing ploy. You know, you can see the way that they painted this. They've like sort of painted the front panel to look like modules, to look like recreations of vintage circuitry modules. Now there might be some recreations of vintage circuitry inside the synthesizer. That's what they tell us. But to paint them like this as modules, I just thought was a completely missed opportunity. Why didn't they make real modules right? If there were like a couple of screws here and we could just lift these things out and swap them in, we could change the order of them. Moog could come out with some nice new ones, we could swap in different filters, we could add some more oscillators. Wouldn't it be fantastic? I mean, it would be really, really fantastic. Now I know that these are maybe not Eurorack dimensions, so maybe they would have needed to come up with a Eurorack size, and that would have made a lot of sense. And then we're talking about the Grandmother ending up being sort of like an equivalent of the walled-off keyboard, where you can slot in your Eurorack modules into it. But that to me would have made sense for this kind of form factor, and I just sort of got the feeling that these are just sort of like painted on. Well, they're painted on, and they are a bit of a marketing ploy. Look, we've got a semi-modular synthesizer with real modules in it, but they're not. Now, if I put aside my prejudices for the moment regarding the name of the synthesizer and its colour scheme, and if I think about the synthesizer logically for a moment, which is thankfully something I ended up doing, then what you've got here is, well, you've got two VCOs, which is nothing special for a semi-modular synthesizer. Most semi-modular synthesizers have two VCOs. But you've got an LFO here with a full frequency range, which means it can act as a third VCO. So we've got a 3 VCO synthesizer with a recreation of vintage circuitry inside it, apparently. So we've really got here something that should sound really rather fantastic and be able to recreate the sounds of a Mini Moog Model D, for example. So that's the reason why I ended up trying the synthesizer for myself and ended up buying one. And I'm very, very glad that I did. There are two reasons why I really love this synthesizer. The first reason is the form factor, the one thing that I didn't think I would like. It really is a wonderfully built instrument. It just feels great. It's got a great keyboard. It's quality. There's absolute quality here, and to me it feels like I'm playing a real instrument. You know, when you have Eurorack gear and you've got lots of bits and pieces and components linked together with cables, you've got like USB cables all over the place, you've got a little USB keyboard and a sequencer and other stuff, you're not really dealing with an instrument, you know, an all-in-one instrument. And this is an all-in-one instrument. I was really quite surprised at how good it feels just to sit down and play the synthesizer. So that's the first thing. That was a big surprise to me. I should also say about the colour scheme, now I've actually got one and I'm looking at it in the flesh. I don't mind the colour scheme at all. It's quite distinctive. You certainly from a long distance can tell when someone is playing a Grandmother. And I don't mind it at all. It really is fine. Now, the second reason why I really love the synthesizer is, of course, its sound. So I ended up playing a Grandmother, I ended up buying a Grandmother, and I ended up loving a Grandmother for the two reasons that I've given: the sort of the real instrument feel and the wonderful sounds that you can get from it. But is that the end of the story? Is it a happy ever after moment? Does my Grandmother and me end up walking off into the sunset together? No, not quite. To be honest with you, once you really start to play this instrument, you'll find that it's very limited in some respects. And I would go as far as to say that what defines the Grandmother is as much what they didn't put in it as it is what they did put in it. And I'm going to try and give you an example in a couple of minutes, practical example where I show you what I mean. But if we just look at the front panel just to start off with here, you'll see that this big black section here, this is the envelope generator. the envelope generator, you get one envelope generator. It takes up an awful lot of space. It's got this flappy slider here for the sustain. It doesn't need to take up all this room. They could have easily made it half the size, and they could have easily have fitted two envelope generators in here. I really don't think it would have increased the cost of the synthesizer at all. I don't know why they didn't do that. The LFO here, I've talked about it already. It's a fantastic LFO. It's got the full frequency range, so you can use it as a third VCO. And you're going to do that. You know, you're tempted to do that and use it as a third VCO. But as soon as you do that, you lose your LFO because you've only got the one. So from a modulation capabilities perspective, this is a very limited synthesizer. And I really don't know why Moog made the decisions that they made with the synthesizer. I'm presuming that they just thought, well, you know, it's semi-modular, you've got patch points, you're going to hook it up to your wonderful you know, array of Eurorack gear, and you'll get over those limitations. That's what you're going to do. And yes, of course, you can end up using Eurorack gear, but I really do think that if you look at the competition, if you look at the other sort of semi-modular synths that are out there, the Arturia Mini Brute, the Dreadbox range of products, there's an awful lot of sound capability that you can get out of those instruments on their own. You can patch from their inputs to their outputs and create lots and lots of sonic capability. You don't need to, you know, immediately go and rush out and hook something up to your synthesizer and invest too heavily in Eurorack gear. And I would really, I'd guess that if you were to look at the number of people that own an Arturia Mini Brute, I would say 99 point something % of them don't actually hook it up to Eurorack gear at all. It just is a nice instrument that makes an awful lot of great sounds that's self-contained. That is not the case with the Grandmother, and I'm going to show you just one of many examples that I've got where you really need to be reaching out to Eurorack gear to use this synthesizer effectively. Okay, so here we are. I've got my Grandmother turned on. Terrible jokes. Let's do a really simple kind of lead patch. I'm going to use the two VCOs to start off with. Ever so slightly detuned. Let's add a little bit of reverb, tiny bit. Just increase the release slightly. And we'll turn down the cutoff. A little bit of glide maybe. And it would be nice to have a little bit of vibrato that we can bring in. So we do that with the modulation section here. It's controllable by the mod wheel, so we turn the mod wheel up. Let's get the rate to be a little bit faster, a bit more like vibrato should be. And then we'll introduce it with this pitch control here. So now we've got control with the mod wheel. So very simple, but now let's add the third oscillator to it to give a kind of fatter, a little bit more detuned kind of lead sound. So we'll do that next. Right, so to use the LFO as a third oscillator, we first of all need to take control of the rate of it and basically get it to track the keyboard, and that's very simple. We've got here a keyboard out in this sort of ARP sequence section here. It's also kind of the the sort of like the MIDI to CV converter inside here as well. So we can take the CV basically from that MIDI to CV converter, the keyboard out, and we've got a socket right here called rate in. That is now setting the rate of this LFO based on what I play on the keyboard or play with a sequencer or a MIDI in basically. But once we've got this set up, we now need to hear it, which means we need to take the output of the LFO and put it into our mixer. So we've got here conveniently a wave out socket, and in the mixer we've got oscillators 1 and 2 in, and we've got a noise source as well. So we're going to override the noise source so that we'll hear this third oscillator. So let's turn it up, and now we have to tune it. It's one octave down, right? It's also playing a sine wave at the moment. Let's switch it to sawtooth. But now we lose our mod wheel vibrato. Lost our LFO basically, so we have no control over vibrato. So let's see what we need to do in order to add vibrato to this 3 VCO setup. Right, so in order to be able to add vibrato, we're going to have to turn to some external Eurorack gear. I've got this little case here with a bunch of modules in it. The one we're interested in is this LFO module here. LFO modules are very, very cheap to buy. They're one of the cheapest modules you can get for Eurorack. The circuitry is very, very simple, but obviously you need some sort of enclosure to put it in, and then you're going to need to power it. So there is an initial cost involved in going into Eurorack, even if you just want to use one particular module. Yes, we've got little Bob here. Bob is looking over me right now and seeing how I patch up his grandmother. Or actually it's my grandmother, but it's also his grandmother, which means we're related. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Right, so patching up this LFO to the synthesizer should, in theory, be simple, but trust me, we're about to disappear down a rabbit hole. Now what I need to do, first of all, is to take the sine wave output from the LFO, which is this particular socket here. And what we need to do with this is to then modulate the pitches of the 2 oscillators and our LFO here, which is acting as an oscillator. Now there's not one single patch point to put this in, but there are individual ones. There's a pitch in here and here on each of the oscillators, and that is specifically for modulating the pitch. And on the LFO itself, we've got gate in, but we're using it already for the keyboard tracking. So we'll come on to the LFO in a minute because it's a bit more complicated. But in terms of the 2 oscillators, we basically need to take this single CV output and put it into 2 inputs. And the way I'm going to do that is to use a little utility circuit here called a mult, and all I have to do is to plug it in to one of those sockets, and then I can take outputs and go to each of the oscillators. That's 1, let's do a smaller cable, and that's number 2. So now we're taking the LFO CV and directly applying it to both oscillators. It's going to sound bad, and I'll tell you why in a second. There we go. So it's really, really massive, and that's because the signal being generated by the LFO is at maximum amplitude, and we need to basically attenuate it. We need to squash it down to a manageable and sort of subtle waveform that is more fitting for a vibrato effect. Now the way that we can do that is to use this little attenuator circuit here on the Grandmother. It takes an input, it's got an output, and then how much of the signal is output is defined by this control here. You can do positive or negative, so I guess it's actually an attenuverter, but we'll plug in our LFO to its input, take another cable to take its output, and then go from the output into the mult. Now how much of the LFO is modulating is going to be affected by this control. So that's the two oscillators. Now in terms of the LFO, this input isn't an input for modulating the pitch, it's an input for actually setting the pitch absolutely, and this is using the 1 volt per octave standard here from the keyboard out into the rate in. Now if I were to take this LFO CV signal via this attenuator into here as well as this, we would get some horrible sounding effects, and we would lose the tracking of the keyboard, and I'll just show you that now. In order to be able to apply this CV from the LFO over to the LFO here, I'm going to have to use a cable like this, because I need to be able to basically have two cables going into one, like that. So now we're having the absolute frequency set based on the keys that I'm pressing, and as an additive effect we're having the LFO applied. Now if I turn down oscillators 1 and 2 so we can just hear this LFO, you'll hear what the problem is. So I'll just try and cancel out as much as possible. There you go. So we've got 0 attenuation right now. But we're no longer tracking the keyboard correctly. If I introduce one of the other oscillators slightly, you'll hear it better. And that's the problem. The problem is I can't just add the LFO CV to the LFO in this way. I'm not an expert on this, but I believe I need some kind of precision adder to be able to get this to work properly, and it's a Eurorack component that I don't own. I've never had this problem before, so the best that I can do is to be able to just give a vibrato effect to the two oscillators and not the third one here. But even then, I haven't got the mod wheel being used. I'm having to apply vibrato by manually turning this control here. Now, I have searched every single square inch of the Grandmother, and I have not found a mod out CV socket on it. So there's no way for me to get, as a patch point, the control voltage of me moving this mod wheel, and that is a big problem. Right, so we've actually got two problems. The first problem is there's no mod out on the Grandmother, so we can't get at our mod wheel. And even if we could get at our mod wheel, this little attenuator circuit here doesn't have a CV in. Now most attenuator circuits will have a CV in, which will allow you to automate the manual turning of this control. So we're going to have to use a piece of Eurorack gear for a replacement for this attenuator. And I've got over here, I hope you can see that this little module here is actually two little VCAs, one above the other. And a VCA is very similar to an attenuator. It takes an input, gives me an output, and then has a control where I can attenuate that signal. In fact, I can amplify it as well. So what I'm going to do is switch over from using this attenuator to using this little VCA, and the reason why I'm going to do that is because VCAs always have a CV input, so that you can apply an LFO or an envelope or whatever it is to the signal that you're amplifying. So I'm going to go and use this. That's the first step. So I'm going to take my LFO output and put it into my VCA. Oops. And then I'm going to take the output from the VCA, and that is what is going to go into my mult down here. Now this is where I need the mod wheel signal, going in here. Now, as I said before, there is no mod out on the Grandmother at all, and the only way I could figure to get access to the mod wheel is actually via MIDI. So whatever I do in terms of fiddling around with the mod wheel here will generate a MIDI control message, which will come out of the MIDI output of the synthesizer. So my best bet is to take a MIDI cable output from the Grandmother and put it into my own independent MIDI to CV converter. And I'm using here this black one here on the left by Erica Synths. It's a MIDI to CV converter. That's where I plug my MIDI cable in, and you'll see here there's a socket called mod out, because most MIDI to CV converters will provide a mod out for you. So the first step is plug my MIDI cable in. Try not to knock Bob over in the process. And then I can take a cable from the mod out and actually use it as my CV in for my amplifier. So one more cable, mod out, coming round to CV in. Right, hope that's working. Let's try it out. So mod wheel all the way up. There we go. So with the mod wheel all the way up, I'll set the maximum amount of modulation that I want. And then when I pull the mod wheel down, we get nothing. So there, that was a rather convoluted way of getting what I wanted, and actually I don't get what I want because I can't, with the Eurorack modules that I've got, I can't find a way to apply pitch modulation accurately to the LFO, which I'm using as a VCO. So that's a little bit disappointing, but this is just one example of how you might need to use Eurorack gear to actually come up with a solution to your problem. So I hope that demonstration really shows you quite clearly how quickly the Grandmother can get quite limited, and then you have to reach out to external Eurorack gear and sometimes put together quite a convoluted solution to what should be a very, very simple problem. Now, I don't want to sound too harsh on Moog, because I know that they listen to people and they've taken people's feedback from the Grandmother and they've implemented it in the Matriarch. If we forget about the headlines of the Matriarch for the moment, if we forget about the 4 VCOs, the stereo filter, the stereo bucket brigade delay, if we just put those things to one side for the moment and look at the details, the Matriarch now does have a mod wheel CV out. The attenuator has got a CV in In fact, there are 3 attenuators for us to use. And yes, we have 2 envelope generators finally. And as well as 2 envelope generators, we also have 2 LFOs. They really have taken people's feedback from the Grandmother and come up with something in the Matriarch which I think is really, really quite special. So I don't want to talk about the Matriarch too much in this video. It certainly deserves its own video, or maybe even more than one video, and that's what I'll be working on next. But for now, I've got to bring this video to a close. I've got to take my Grandmother, I've got to put her in a box, and I've got to send her off to her new owner. I'm going to be sad to see the Grandmother go, despite her limitations. It's a great instrument. She is a great instrument. And I think that if you have got some Eurorack gear and you really want a centerpiece of a keyboard kind of synth that sits there at the heart of your Eurorack gear, then the Grandmother is a fantastic addition. So that's all I've got time for this time. Until the next time, as usual, thank you very, very much for watching.